So, admittedly, I've been critical in the past of Krita and its animation workflow for various kinds of bugginess, but I was I still use it fairly frequently, actually, for like background paintings and stuff like that. Compared to Open Tunes, it's a more direct, painterly kind of experience. If you want to be able to just dive in and start painting, and vis-a-vis what you would do in GIMP or Photoshop, Krita's definitely more oriented that way than Open Tunes, particularly because of layers and blending modes and things like that are all part of the production process, if you will. In Open Tunes, you can do all those things, but typically you have to add filters through the schematic, and then you only see them in the rendered preview and that sort of thing. So it's just a little clunkier workflow. So there are things about Krita that do recommend it. And the version I'm using right now seems to be, I think 4.1.7, yeah, 417. Yeah, it's pretty stable. Here's the deal. I was looking at this guy's YouTube channel, Ed Tadeo, and I gotta say, I recommend this video, Let's Animate Episode 5, Krita Wolverine. Number one, he's using Krita for all his animation work. Now, this guy's actually a professional comic book artist, so he doesn't animate professionally, he does it as a hobby. But this video here is not only an interesting study in character animation with Krita. So here you're going to kind of see Wolverine move. I think it's going to transition. Yeah, here you go. So here's what he did. All done in Krita. It's obviously, it looks great. And in this section back here, this is a great lesson all its own in background painting, the way he created this rock wall, and it kind of inspired me. I think I'm going to use some of these ideas to modify the rock wall that happens to be in my animation, because the ninjas climb up that rock wall. So anyway, I want to recommend this guy's YouTube channel. So what I did was I actually pulled this. I pulled up an episode of Gintama, and this is what happened to come up. So I thought, okay, I'll just draw that guy in Krita and change them a little bit, kind of make it my style more. But so anyway, here's the tutorial part of this video is going to be simply this. What is the least you need to know to get busy animating with Krita? Number one, you probably want to keep your what I'm going to do is I'm going to just do a demonstration and then point out the things that I've seen you kind of need to do or use, as we go. So number one, the thing I just bumped into is when I'm sketching, under tool options, I don't want the stabilizer on. It's great for inking, but when you're just sketching, it does slow down the interaction of the pen against the, when you're drawing, it's slowed down. The stabilizer, what it does is it gives you the ability to make smooth straight lines better, but of course it causes a drag as well. So it's not so great for sketching. So why don't we just go ahead and, for lack of a better idea, I'll create this character that seems somewhat happy. Let's give him a great big happy mouth. Okay, so here's our sketch. Now if I was working in Krita, and actually what I should do is go ahead and give him a body. Okay, so from a planning standpoint, number one, think about what is or is not going to move. Okay, because if his head's going to move and be animated, but his body isn't, then you might want to go ahead and create the body and the head in two different layers. So that probably goes without saying. So then what I would typically do is turn the opacity of that layer down. And okay, so here's another point. When you first start working in Krita, at least least in my installation, the default layer that is presented to you when you start drawing is not transparent. It's white. And so generally, you actually don't want to use the default layer. Now you can overcome that by going like this. When you start a new project, just hit the delete key, and what it does is it deletes the white layer and replaces it with a transparent one, and then every one you create after that is going to be transparent. So I'm going to kill that, not save it. Okay, so this guy, what I would typically do when it's time to ink is I would probably turn the stabilizer on. Alright, and so let me go ahead and ink this fella. Okay, so now what I see is that I want the guide layer to be even lighter. I want it to be really, really easy to see my ink lines. Okay, so let's just go ahead and I'm going to turn the stabilizer on more aggressively, so you can really feel it dragging. Actually, you as a viewer, you probably can't see this, but okay, that's not acceptable. Okay, so there really is no proper arc tool, by the way, in Krita. You can kind of get there with the Bezier curve tool. You go like this, click, click, and then if you drag, you get a curve. But honestly, compared to a proper arc tool, it's hard to control. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. Most of the hotkeys are similar to OpenTunes. The B key for the brush. Okay, so I said that just to be not stupid, I'm going to put the body and head in separate layers. So I'm going to go ahead and just make his neck a closed shape, and then trace this. Okay, so again, what's good about Krita? Well, the quality of the lines are very nice in Krita. Okay, so there's our basic drawing. Now, how are we going to do our fill operations? Well, there's two ways we could do it. Again, this is something that makes it different from OpenTunes. Let's say we're going to give this guy sort of a bluish cloak. Okay, well, if I hit the F key here, I can actually do the fill onto a separate layer. Okay, which is kind of convenient. Alright, and then when I turn this on, when I turn this on, I could, and by the way, the default in Krita is for fill operations to respect all layers. So we're going to run into a problem here. If I try to fill this, it's actually not going to fill this area because of the part that I already filled. So if I turn that off, oh, I see. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I filled it into the same layer. So let's do it this way. Let's do it this way. Alright, we've got this, which is now into two separate layers, and that's fine. There's another way to do it. So another thing I'm going to show you here is to merge the levels, which is Control E by default. So that just flattened that level. So now that's actually one, I'm saying level. Every other program calls it a layer. I've always called them layers when it's supposed to be levels. Okay, so anyway. So Control click is your eyedropper. Now I'm going to do the head a different way. I'm going to switch from normal to behind mode for doing the fill, and you get the same result as you can see. So click, click. Let's just use kind of a dark tone for the mouth. I'm going to go Control middle mouse drag to zoom. Okay, so now the question becomes, filling in behind mode is pretty good, and if we go Control 0 to go to actual size, it looks like that, the fills are, they look good. Let's compare the quality of them to the fills that we did in two separate layers. Okay, as you can see, so here's another thing about Krita is when you zoom way in, you get this kind of a grid going on. That doesn't does make it easier to see sort of the pixel values. And if you wanted to go in with the brush, B key, I'm hitting Control, Sample. I'm still in behind mode, so I'm probably going to need to switch this back to normal. So there's another difference with Krita, is that there are a quadzillion blending modes in Krita. And I typically only use a few of them, but okay, so now I see what appears to be something of a bug. I'm hitting Control, click. Okay, that time it took. It didn't seem to be taking my my sample. Okay, so anyway, I'm going to touch this up. My point was that I wanted to compare these fills to these fills, and it would be my judgment that generally speaking, I've found this to be the case, is that you're generally better off to fill in a second level and then merge it down in Krita, because even if you do it in behind mode, it tends to be a little winky around the borders. So your mileage may vary, and when you're using the fill tool, if you look at the tool options, you have the ability to adjust the threshold, which I always leave at 1. You can grow the selection, which I generally do, by 2 pixels, and you can feather it, which I generally do by 1 pixel. That seems to be a good middle ground setting. Okay, so now we have our character in 2 different layers. So let's, I'm not going to go too far with the details on this character. I will say that if I wanted to go ahead and do shadowing, the way to do it, probably the best, there's really 2 ways to do it. One is, again, go into another layer. Just go here, make it black, and then go ahead and paint, but then click this little button here that says what's it actually called? Inherit alpha. Okay, so you click Inherit alpha, that causes it to respect the underlying drawing. Now if I had both of these on, you can see that it's gonna inherit the alpha from whatever layers are visible. So if you're planning to bake it down, or you want to be more specific about what's being shadowed, then you want to turn off layers that aren't currently in play. In this case, it's we're kind of good either way. So I'm going to go ahead and now I can turn the opacity down and then turn it back up, and I could either merge this down to this layer, or I could just leave it unmerged for the moment. So what I'm going to do is delete that layer and show you another way to do shadows, which would be to, again, just doing some black like that, okay? But what I'm going to do is click this up here, which does inherit or preserve alpha, is what that's called, for the layer. And then in this case, this is where you'd want to turn your opacity down on the brush, and I'll show you why. Because this is very cool. The advantage of doing it this way is you can keep everything on a single layer if that's important to you. Okay? Now, having done that, let me see what happens if we turn this other layer back on. Okay, so you can see that the preserve alpha only affected the current layer. Let's see what happens if we go like this. Okay? So when preserve alpha is done on at the brush level, it is relegated to the current level or layer that you're working on, which is kind of convenient. There's one other advantage, if you will. You could look at it as an advantage or a disadvantage, which is that if you go ahead and smack it down a second time, as you can see, it begins to build on itself. Okay, so being at 9% opacity, I presume that if I did this 10 or 11 times, it would actually make its way to black. Okay, so when you do your preserve alpha and shadows on a completely separate layer, the whatever opacity you set, it doesn't matter how much you paint, it's always going to be just that dark, assuming all of your shadows are solid black. If you do it at the brush level, it builds up on itself. Okay? So it just really depends on your application. So I could do the same thing down here. And let's say I want the shadows under his neck to be a little darker. And this is again where working in Krita is a little more visceral and a little quicker, because all I have to do is just go ahead and add a second layer of shadowing here, and I've instantly got the effect I was looking for. To get 2 layers of shadow or levels of shadow in OpenToons would be a little clunkier. Would require a little more housekeeping, a little more setup. Okay? That didn't work because I was in the wrong layer. Alright, so now one question that might arise is, well, what if you make a mistake? Since you're painting that shadow directly in to the level or the layer, what if you make a boo-boo? Well, it's actually pretty easy to fix, because I can zoom in like this, and now I move the opacity of my brush back up to 100%, because here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and hit Shift and drag, left mouse, to make my brush a little smaller. And then all I'm going to do is sample the eye color and then paint over it. So I can touch it up that way. Sample the eye color, touch it up. Or the opposite, sample the shadow color and say, well, I want to add a little bit more shadow activity here. So again, that's kind of Krita's advantage, is you can get to something that looks like a finished result generally probably a little quicker than you would in, whoopsie poo, my bad, quicker than you would in OpenToons. So now I have a question. Why does that sample seem to be grabbing the wrong color? It's interesting. If I drag around, this is something I did notice earlier, and that's where, again, you want to be aware of bugs if they exist. But I mean, clearly I'm sampling this color, but what's coming out looks a little darker. So, try it on your own and see if maybe I'm crazy and there's something going on here that I'm not aware of, that I'm missing. Okay, and I'm going to grab that color and give a slight indication of a nose. Like so. Mr. Happy Happy. Okay, so now let's talk about animation. It was fairly quick to, get a character blocked in there, and now we want to animate him. Okay, well, there's a few things to be aware of. First of all, if I was only going to animate the head positioning, let's say, and then do some lip sync over top of it, of course, the first thing I would do right now is, with this initial drawing, is erase the mouth. So let's go ahead and do that, and the way I'm going to do it is by actually just sampling the skin color and then making my brush a little bigger. By the way, I want to turn the stabilizer back off. It's really only useful, I find, when you're doing inking. Okay, so we will of course have another layer for the mouth. Generally, you're kind of leaving lip sync for last anyway. Okay, so here's, as I said, what's the least you need to know? Well, when it comes to keyframes, if I were to insert a keyframe, which I have mapped to the insert key, the head would disappear, because it would effectively create a blank keyframe. Alright, now if you do what's called copy the keyframe, or I guess it would be insert a hold frame. They've changed the terminology in the latest version of Krita. But for me, that's control insert, which inserts a keyframe but preserves the drawing that already exists on that level. Be aware that if you hit the insert key to insert a keyframe, which I just did, and then hit undo, the keyframe stays, but the drawing is restored. So you get the same effective result as you did with doing the copy keyframe operation. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I just want to give a nod to his head. So this is the same as very similar to the select tool in OpenTunes, in that you can set the anchor wherever you want, and you can also turn on onion skins, which is kind of useful to sort of see what you're doing. So the animation part's not too bad. What you're not going to get in Krita is an intuitive way to parent one layer to another, to link them together. You can kind of do it, and I'll show that, but basically that functionality isn't there, and you're not going to get any keyframe interpolation. Everything is frame by frame. So with that, what if you wanted to do a camera move? Okay. So effectively, you need to take this whole thing and grow it over several frames to make it look like the camera's pushing in. How would you do that? Well, the problem is that both of these levels need to move together. All right. So what I would do is grab them both and hit Control G, which is to create a quick group. Okay. So now with the group, I can hit the insert key, and I want to click this little button here that says pass through on. What that does is, if I create a keyframe or introduce some action like I'm about to do with the group, then what actually happens is keyframes are created on the constituent layers. In order to see that, I'm going to go ahead and add these layers here. So add existing layer, layer 4. Okay, so now when I select the group, I can see these other layers. That's kind of useful. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is hit the transform tool, and let's just say, for the sake of argument, that we're going to start here. Okay. And now I'm going to go to the next frame and hit the S key, expand this out, go here, hit the S key, expand it out even further. Let's see what happened. Okay, so what happened was the animation only happened to the head. Okay, now I'm going to show you why. The reason why is Krita's concept of keyframes is such that if you haven't created a keyframe, it disregards the very idea of animation in that layer. So therefore, in order for this to work, I need to at least put one keyframe. So I'm going to hit Control Insert, and you can see this line just appeared. So now there's at least a concept of animation for this level. Now if I go to the group, and I'm going to give this an intelligent name, group. Now if I go to the group, alright, we were going to shrink it on the first frame, and then by the way, it looks to me like this backfired a little bit, so I'm going to go make a correction in that individual layer of the head. Alright, so my undo didn't really work properly. Oops, sorry, that's not what I wanted to do. I want to go to layer 2, make an adjustment. So I'm just compensating for the fact that I already had introduced some animation, and when I didn't hit it, I think I didn't hit undo enough times. Okay, so now, okay, and here in the group, I'm going to go ahead and make it bigger. So you can see what happened down here is when you did the animation on the group, you don't see any indication of keyframes on the group layer, but what you do see is keyframes being added on the constituent layers. So that's what pass through means. So when you make that create that animation on a group, that's how you can effectively propagate keyframes across a group. It's as close as you can get to a transformation tool that links layers. It's as close as you're going to get in Krita. Okay, so now the next question would be, I'm big on the concept of building out when you're doing animation. In other words, I'm going to create as few keyframes as possible so that if I just step through with my arrow keys, I can sort of tell the story. I can see what's going on. I'm not trying to work out the exact timing, but at some point you do want to work out the exact timing. So you've got to be able to move these keyframes around and potentially ripple them as well. So let's look at how you would do that. Well, it's actually really simple. What you would do is grab this layer and this layer, so I'm hitting shift so I can grab both of them, and if I hit the alt key, it effectively ripples. Okay, so in other words, it's going to take all the keyframes that are downstream and move them along with the ones I'm moving right now. Okay, now so it's pretty obvious. You can see that you're able to fiddle with more than one layer at a time as long as you grab them. Now if I hit control and drag them, it's going to make a copy. So I can drag this and copy it back here. Or I can just hit nothing except drag and it'll move them. So left click to move them, control click to copy them, alt click to ripple them. So if I inserted this keyframe in here and I say, well, in the head layer I want to go ahead and make a little change. So boom, boom. Okay, that's fine. Now I'm going to go back to the group just for, and you can see this is a little silly because this layer was already enlarged from the work I did before. So let's compensate for that. Let's go to the group, select the whole thing, and shrink it back down again. It's probably not going to be perfect because I'm guessing, but hit enter. Okay. And now, again, if I grab these two frames and hit Alt, I can close that gap back up like that. Okay? So, you know, building out and manipulating your keyframes is pretty doable in Krita. Alright? And now what I might do is just add another layer on top of this for lip sync. So let's call this lip sync. And let's go ahead and do some doodles. One. Okay, so now what's going to happen is if I erase this and draw something else, well, or let's just say I draw something else, you can see that it's in both frames. Okay, remember, Krita doesn't add keyframes automatically. As far as Krita is concerned, this is just a paint layer. Okay, so you have to, according to the terminology that currently in Krita, it would be insert a hold frame. What that means is you're inserting a frame, preserving the drawing, and as long as you don't insert a new frame, that drawing will remain in force. Okay, so now if I hit the insert key, again, I'm just hitting insert to, I'm going to fill that. Okay, so now you can see what goes on. And again, it's kind of convenient in Krita to, you can stack up your layers as much as you want, and then when you're ready, you can, for example, you could merge the group. So boom, I merged the group. Now I've taken all my work that I'm happy with and flattened it down to a single layer. Cool. What I would recommend in most cases is go ahead and save your project with all the layers expanded out, then bake it down and resave it, so that if you have to get back to the original, you know, we're thinking ahead. Now, insofar as backgrounds are concerned, if I were to add a layer for a background, and let's go down here, just put it on the bottom, I will tell you that, let's go ahead and fill that in. And probably that's going to be, yeah, see, you can see it did the respect the alpha kind of thing. So now I'm just going to make a really big brush, paint that in. Okay. So what is not going to happen is at this point there would be no way to take this layer and, well, let's just say we want to have a little bit of variation here. Okay, so there's no way now to make this inherit the motion. You know, if you wanted to have the background actually move with the character a little bit or create parallax, you can't do it. Now what you could do if you really wanted to do that and you're determined, then you could obviously export the animation of just the character as a ping sequence and do the camera move in OpenTunes or Blender or whatever program you like. So I think that's actually probably enough. If you know how to manipulate the keyframes, if you know how to deal with layers and you know how to group them, you've got most of what you need to be able to just sit down and get busy animating with Krita. You know, because it's the tools are simple and they're reasonably effective. And my tests with rendering out animations from this version 4 of Krita, it seems to render out just fine. It doesn't seem to introduce those. It used to have strange bugs where square blocks of the drawing would just like disappear and stuff. And so I think I'm gonna stop there and say, obviously, if you are interested in animating with Krita, it is doable. This is the project I did earlier this morning when I was just testing some of these things. I did the same thing. I added a camera move, and I put a background behind him. And actually, this is the last thing I'll end with today. What if you get into it and you realize that there's something about your drawing or your color, for example, that isn't quite right? This is another thing that Krita has that's cool. If you were to, I'm going to turn this off and you can see that the skin color is a little different here. Now if I were to take this level that has this guy's head and add a filter to it, so I'm going to add a Gaussian blur just so you can see what it looks like. Okay, the problem is that the blur is only applied on that cell or that frame. However, if you add a filter mask, it's applied to the entire level. So what I did was I added a filter mask, which I believe F3 lets you adjust the properties, and the filter that I chose was a simple hue saturation value adjustment. And so I was able to make a modification of the guy's skin color you know, across the whole animation. Now another thing you can do is if you're on your first frame and you haven't gone too far and you want to make an adjustment. Let's say I said this guy's tie, I don't want to change the color, but it seems like it's a little too bright to me. What you could do is you could hit the fill tool and just add black, let's say, but put the opacity way down here. Okay? So now, obviously it doesn't work perfectly because this already has shadows and stuff baked in. But as you can see, you can make adjustments with the fill tool, and obviously that what you can't do is make a painting adjustment like that on an adjustment layer so that it propagates across all animated frames. You can't do that. But if you plan ahead and catch your mistakes early, no big deal. Okay, so here I'm just going to hit okay, and I'm going to point out, by the way, that this is another little bit of bugginess with Krita. You'll notice that when I'm coming back to frame 1, the painting that I just did has kind of disappeared. Why? And there, now it's back. So, there's definitely things in Krita that are still a little strange when it comes to probably memory management. But as long as you save your work frequently and plan ahead, it can be a good tool to get you from concept to a pretty, respectable looking result very quickly. And then you can take this whole sequence and maybe cut it into a greater video edit, or even bring this sequence into OpenTunes, either as a complete image sequence, or you could break it into two pieces and put the background in its separate sequence, or a sequence or a flat image, and composite that way. So okay, with that, it's been 30 minutes ish. I am going to stop and say that Krita, it has some things going for it. And I definitely recommend you play with it, because even if you don't use it as your main animation tool, it's definitely a really, really powerful and feature complete paint program too. So anyway, that's it for now. See ya.